Modern Melbourne looks ordinary at first sight. No busy cafes, trams rolling past, people heading home without a second thought. But from 1998 to 2010, the city was in the middle of a quiet conflict that claimed 36 underworld figures, one killing after another. It became one of the most violent chapters in Australia's criminal history, and most people never saw it coming. To understand how it started, we have to go back to Carlton. Lygon Street wasn't just a dining strip, it was the base for a small group of men who built their influence through clubs, gambling, and long-standing connections that stretched across the city. For years, their world ran in the background, steady, controlled, and mostly contained. But eventually, that world collided with a new generation chasing faster money and wider territory. And from that moment on, Melbourne changed. What decisions pushed these groups toward a decade of bloodshed? And how did a neighbourhood operation grow into a statewide power struggle? Like the video, subscribe to the channel, and let's begin. Melbourne didn't wake up one morning with an underworld problem. It grew slowly, piece by piece, in the kinds of places most people don't look twice at. Old pubs, late-night cafes, back rooms where deals were made quietly and nobody asked questions. And in Carlton, a tight Italian community built around Lygon Street, a small group of men began forming something much bigger than anyone realised at the time. By the 1970s, these men were already moving through nightclubs, racetracks, card rooms, and the docks. Nothing official tied them together, but they kept crossing paths around the same money and the same opportunities. Eventually, those loose connections turned into the group people would later call the Carlton Crew. They didn't act like a Hollywood crime syndicate. They kept things simple. Bookmakers, enforcers, debt collectors, men who handled problems quietly and made sure money went where it needed to go. And they spread their influence carefully. By the early 2000s, public reports suggested the crew and their extended circle had somewhere between 50 and 100 people involved. Their strength wasn't in being loud, it was in the connections they built over decades. Family ties, friendships from the waterfront, and favours that didn't need to be written down. These relationships kept the crew stable. Even when someone was arrested or taken out of the picture, the machine kept running. No single person held the whole group together. The influence was spread out, woven into everyday life in Carlton. Over the years, the crew also brushed up against other criminal networks, Calabrian-linked families, people in unions, and independent traffickers who needed safe contacts or extra muscle. But at the heart of it all, the Carlton identity stayed close to Lygon Street. That street wasn't just a hangout, it showed who controlled what, club doors stayed protected, it worked, until Melbourne started changing. New money, new players, and new ambitions were coming fast, and the old way of doing things was about to get hit from every direction. Before the headlines, before the cameras, Melbourne's underworld already had its key figures, men whose names carried weight long before the Gangland War officially began. One of the most recognisable was Alphonse Alfie Gangitano, born 22nd April 1957. You didn't need to be told who he was. Alfie stood out anywhere. By the late 1980s, he controlled nightclub doors, ran fight promotions, dipped into racing circles, and built the reputation that earned him the title, the Black Prince of Lygon Street. Some months, his operations were pulling in six-figure cash flow, enough to buy loyalty, influence, and the kind of muscle that didn't need to advertise itself. Then there was Graham the Munster Kinniburgh, born 20th October 1942. Almost the opposite of Alfie in personality, but every bit as respected. While Alfie dominated rooms, Kinniburgh moved through them quietly, dealing with problems before anyone else even noticed them. If something needed to be handled quietly and efficiently, his name was the one people mentioned. He didn't chase attention. He didn't need to. His reputation did the work for him, but the Carlton Crew wasn't built on just two men. They had a wider circle, operators who managed jukebox routes, gambling rooms, late-night venues, and the type of collection work nobody talked about publicly. Some came from the waterfront, others from petty crime, but they all learned fast. Unregistered cars, disposable phones, and backroom arrangements that kept money moving without attracting attention. They made sure the books balanced, the clubs stayed cooperative, and debts were settled without argument. Their reach wasn't limited to back alleys. Many had connections inside unions, sports clubs, and local businesses. It only took a handshake or a quiet favour to shift control of a venue or settle a dispute. Influence spread quietly through these networks like a current. None of these men claimed to be kings. They didn't need thrones or titles. Together they formed the engine that kept the Carlton Crew running. And whenever this engine moved, Melbourne felt the vibration. And the next shift was coming, something that would break the balance they'd built. By the late 1990s, Melbourne's underworld was dealing with something far more serious than old rivalries. The real change came from a new product moving through the city: amphetamines. This wasn't like gambling, protection, or club deals. This was fast to make, fast to move, and capable of generating money at a pace nobody in the old networks had ever seen. Around the world, the market for these stimulants was exploding into a multi-billion-dollar industry, and Oceania became one of the busiest regions in that trade. In Victoria, the impact was immediate. The entire criminal landscape shifted. Small crews that once scraped by suddenly saw money coming in overnight. People who used to fight over nightclub doors were now fighting for access to labs, import routes, and distribution chains. A new kind of operator stepped forward. People who treated the trade like a business, not a weekend side job. One name rose fast in this period: Tony Mockbill. His network connected overseas suppliers, suburban labs, and local distributors in a way older crews simply weren't prepared for. When one of his production sites exploded in the late 1990s, it showed just how big the operation really was and how dangerous the game had become. The money changed everything. Collectors became wholesalers, runners became investors. And the muscle that once guarded club doors now protected chemical shipments worth hundreds of thousands of dollars. One mistake didn't just cost someone a cut, it could cost them an entire supply line. With that kind of money on the table, disputes turned far more serious. A disagreement wasn't about losing a street corner anymore, it was about losing millions. Betrayals didn't end with warnings. They ended quietly and often permanently. Soon, authorities began tightening their focus. Raids increased. Surveillance got smarter. Traffickers who weren't prepared either ran, restructured, or retaliated. Some fled the country. Some dug in deeper, and others settled issues before someone did it for them. The old Carlton world, the steady, predictable one, couldn't keep up, and the next major conflict was already on its way, heading straight for Melbourne's criminal scene. On the 16th of January 1998, the pressure inside Melbourne's underworld finally snapped. Alphonse "Alfie" Gangitano, the Black Prince of Lygon Street, was found shot inside his Templestowe home.
Crime figure Alphonse Gangitano was gunned down in his Templestowe home. His wife found him lying in a pool of blood in the laundry. He'd been shot 3 times in the head and body. His killer has not been found.
40 years old, gone in silence. No witnesses, no warnings. Just a quiet suburban house holding a message everyone in the underworld understood. Someone had crossed a line that couldn't be uncrossed. The scene didn't look messy, it looked controlled. Whoever walked into that home knew Alfie, knew the layout, and knew they had only seconds to do what they came to do. Gangitano wasn't a small player. He had ties to nightclub scenes, racing circles, protection arrangements, and long-running disputes that stretched across both allies and rivals. And then, in one moment, he was removed from the board. His final hours drew attention fast. Jason Moran was linked to visiting the house shortly before the killing. Mark Moran's name surfaced as well. Word spread through Carlton and Ascot Vale faster than facts could catch up. But nothing stuck, no arrests, no charges, just rumours, shadows, and questions that no one wanted to answer out loud. The effect of Alfie's death was immediate. He wasn't just a name, he was a stabiliser. Someone whose presence alone kept minor tensions from turning into real problems. Once he was gone, old disagreements suddenly carried weight. Men who once relied on him to mediate situations now had to defend their own positions. And in an underworld built on ego, money, and reputation, that kind of vacuum doesn't stay empty for long. His death didn't officially start the Gangland war, but it triggered the shift. The balance that held Melbourne's criminal world together began to tilt. Meetings grew colder, trust thinned out, Factions started watching each other with sharper eyes. Nobody knew it then. But this quiet hit inside a suburban home was the first spark. The moment the fuse was lit. From here on, the city would be pulled into years of retaliation, fractured alliances, and a series of killings that would leave more than 30 underworld figures dead. And the next strike wasn't far behind. After Gangitano's death, Melbourne's underworld didn't settle. It tightened. New faces stepped forward. Old rivalries resurfaced. And tensions that once stayed hidden began creeping into the open. And right in the middle of that shift stood a man most crews barely noticed at first. Carl Williams. He wasn't tied to the old Carlton networks or the waterfront circles. He came up through the fast money drug trade, a world where loyalty changed quickly and ambition was everything. The turning point came on the 13th of October 1999 at Essendon North Reserve. What was meant to be a simple meeting ended with Jason Moran shooting Williams in the stomach. Williams survived, but that moment flipped a switch inside him. That single gunshot didn't just wound him, it created a new obsession. From that day on, Carl Williams wasn't just trying to make money, he was building a plan, and he took his time. On 21st June 2003, Jason Moran and his associate Pasquale Barbaro were sitting in a van at a children's football event when a gunman approached. Seconds later, both were dead. In broad daylight, it was a message, and everyone understood who it pointed back to. Then, almost exactly a year later, on 21st June 2004, Mark Moran was shot outside his Ascot Vale home. Another major figure gone. Another hit tied to the same escalating feud. By the mid-2000s, Williams would eventually admit involvement in multiple killings, including several connected to the Moran family and the wider underworld conflict. Each confession stripped more power away from the older networks. Each death pushed Williams further into the role of a leader, a role he created for himself, not one he inherited. And while the Carlton Crew relied on decades of tradition, Williams relied on momentum. He grew his drug operations fast, moved product across suburbs, and attracted allies who followed him because he delivered results. Andrew Veneman became one of his closest operators, loyal, dangerous, and effective. Under Williams, Melbourne wasn't dealing with street fights anymore, it was dealing with a battlefield. Every hit shifted the map, every funeral changed the balance. And while Williams was rising, the war around him was only getting darker. By the early 2000s, Melbourne's underworld violence had a pattern that was getting harder to ignore. The hits weren't sloppy, they weren't random, they were targeted, precise, and carried out by people who clearly knew what they were doing. Between 1998 and 2004, more than a dozen underworld figures were taken out, one after another. It was obvious the city wasn't watching scattered grudges anymore, it was watching a full-scale conflict. In 2003, a new response stepped into the picture, the Purana Task Force. This wasn't a typical unit. Purana was created specifically to dig into organised crime figures tied to the growing stream of killings. They weren't racing around trying to put out fires. They were building a long game. Purana tracked who met with whom, who moved money, who travelled late at night, and who suddenly had more cash than their day job could explain. They followed drug financiers, transporters, and the inner circle that helped elevate Carl Williams from a mid-level operator into one of the most influential figures in the conflict. Traditional policing hadn't slowed anything down, so Purana shifted tactics: surveillance, intelligence mapping, months-long investigations, and quiet pressure behind the scenes. As patterns emerged, things started cracking. Between 2004 and 2007, arrests began stacking up, and this time, they hit the right people. Associates broke under pressure. Deals were made. Information changed hands. The once solid structure behind Melbourne's Gangland activity finally started to lose its shape. Then came the moment that changed the entire landscape. In 2007, Carl Williams received a life sentence after admitting involvement in multiple murders, including the deaths of Jason Moran, Lewis Moran, and Mark Malia. The man who had driven much of the violence was now behind bars, his grip on the streets gone. But Purana didn't stop with Williams. They kept targeting traffickers, enforcers, accountants, anyone with a link to the networks that kept the war alive. Each arrest revealed how deep the connections went. Drugs, laundering systems, debt networks, and alliances stretching well beyond Carlton. The killings finally slowed. Melbourne started to breathe again. But underneath that calm was a different feeling. The sense that the war wasn't finished yet, and the final, most brutal chapters were still waiting. By late 2003, Melbourne's Gangland conflict wasn't rumbling in the background anymore. It was fully alive, and everyone involved felt the heat. The moment that proved it came on the 13th of December 2003, when Graham Basikohubo, the Munster Kinniburgh, stepped outside his Kew home. He'd spent decades smoothing problems, settling disputes, and keeping dangerous situations calm. But that night, none of it mattered. Two gunmen were waiting in the dark. The ambush was fast and controlled, and a man who had survived almost everything the underworld could throw at him was gone in seconds. His death didn't just shock people, it opened cracks that his presence had been holding together. Melbourne barely had time to process that hit before another shook the city. On 23rd March 2004, Andrew Benji Venyamin, a feared and unpredictable figure linked to several major killings, met his end in a cramped storeroom at a Carlton restaurant. It happened in the middle of the day, no masks, no dramatic escape, just a confrontation that turned fatal. The shooter later walked free after arguing self-defense, and the case exposed how tangled and unpredictable the war had become. Then, only 8 days later, came another major blow. On 31st March 2004, Lewis Moran entered the Brunswick Club. He never made it back out. Masked gunmen walked into the venue and struck quickly, ending the life of a man who had survived some of Melbourne's most volatile years. It was a public hit, witnessed by bystanders, a clear statement that the conflict was now out in the open. Investigations later connected the killing to a chain of payments and deals that eventually led to multiple convictions. And the violence didn't stop there. On February 6, 2006, Mario Condello, a longtime operator with deep ties and deeper threats, walked into his Toorak driveway. Moments later, he was dead. The timing was alarming. He was due in court the very next day. His funeral drew hundreds, proof of how many circles his life and his death touched. None of these killings were random. Each one shifted power, exposed alliances, and reminded everyone that in Melbourne's underworld, visibility made you vulnerable. And even after the smoke cleared, the city was left with scars that wouldn't fade quickly. By 2006, Melbourne's Gangland war was collapsing under its own weight. Too many leaders were gone, too many enforcers were locked up, and too many alliances had shattered. The underworld didn't fall in one dramatic moment. It faded, piece by piece, until the streets finally felt different. But even as the body count slowed, the conflict didn't leave a clean ending behind. Some of the era's most well-known killings remain unsolved even today. Nikolai Radev, taken out in a violent street hit in 2003, Pasquale Barbaro Sr., shot outside his home that same year. Mario Condello, assassinated in 2006, despite being under heavy threat. Not one of these cases resulted in a conviction. Years later, official reviews still pointed to gaps, missing links, unnamed players, and questions that nobody could answer with certainty for a war that claimed more than 30 underworld figures between 1998 and 2010. The truth about some of its biggest moments is still locked behind silence and fear. The fallout changed Melbourne. Names that once dominated Carlton cafes and nightclubs vanished entirely. The Morans, the Barbaros, operators who once moved through the city as if nothing could touch them. By the late 2000s, funerals became major events. But the end of the old crews didn't leave a vacuum for long. New groups moved in. Outlaw motorcycle clubs expanded. Money laundering grew more sophisticated, shifting from cash pickups to real estate portfolios and offshore accounts. Organised crime didn't disappear. It evolved, becoming quieter, smarter, and harder to trace. Culturally, the Gangland era became part of Australia's memory. Shows, documentaries, and news specials replayed the events, turning dates and crime scenes into symbols of a decade the city still hasn't fully forgotten. The war eventually stopped. The killings ended, but the shadows it created never really left. They still hang over certain streets, certain names, and certain moments. Reminders of how quickly Melbourne's underworld once changed and how deeply it scarred the city. When the violence finally slowed and the major players were gone, Melbourne didn't snap back to normal. It carried the weight of unanswered questions, unsolved murders, and families who never learned the full story behind what happened. Some alliances dissolved without explanation, some names vanished forever. Which moment from this conflict left the biggest mark on Melbourne in your eyes? And which figure do you think changed the direction of the war the most? Tell us in the comments. Like the video, subscribe for more true crime stories, and thank you for watching.